What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 competitive budget decks for the March 2018 format. I know a lot of you guys love playing this game competitively, but don't have the money to spend on $200 playsets of Evenly Matched or all the expensive hand traps at this game's disposal. However, I've got 5 decks that you can probably get for around $100 to $150, main and extra deck included. Now, one big boon for budget players in the month of March is the fact that Legendary Collection Kaiba is going to be reprinting some of the most expensive hand traps in this game, making them much more accessible for budget players to access. So even though the decks I'm going to be discussing today might not necessarily include those cards, keep an eye out for this because this set is going to allow anyone who wants to play on a budget to have access to these cards and start including them in their budget builds. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always, and today we have a lot of them, so I actually have to read them off of a list. So big shout outs today to Frozen Courtroom, Jerry, Tyler, Etlis, Genixo, Ryan, Vuth, Eric, Matt, and Zenithal for upping his pledge as well. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, we've got Gem Knight FTK. Now, I don't necessarily condone playing an FTK strategy, but I have to give credit where credit is due. This deck, while not only being able to make to the top cut of YCS Bochum, and also almost making the top cut of YCS Atlanta, this deck is capable of winning, and it's one of the cheapest decks you can possibly afford if you're looking to step up your game and enter the competitive meta. The reason for that is because this deck, pretty much all the cards that are needed to play this deck, you're not using cards like hand traps or traditional cards that you would play in a more contemporary meta deck. You're playing cards that facilitate your win condition of FTKing your opponent, and a lot of these cards don't have use in any other deck, so they're very, very inexpensive, apart from a couple cards that we're going to discuss in a moment. Now, those expensive cards, I mean, yeah, you've got to afford stuff like Brilliant Fusion and Gem Knight Seraphinite, and that's kind of, those cards are expensive mainly because they're used in other decks, and apart from cards like Master Diamond, Brilliant Diamond, and, you know, maybe 1 or 2 other cards, everything else in the deck is so inexpensive because it's a bunch of random Gem Knight cards that have no other purpose outside of being played in this particular deck. Gem Knight FTK is a bit of a glass cannon one-trick pony style deck, meaning that if you don't FTK your opponent, you're pretty much going to lose that game. You do have an alternate win condition in the fact that you could just play Gem Knight Beatdown because you have still the potential to do a bunch of damage through the Gem Knight monsters themselves if you don't OTK your opponent, so I guess it has a little bit of an alternate win condition outside of that. However, I don't necessarily condone this strategy because it is a bit linear and it doesn't really have any flexibility outside of that particular playstyle. However, the reason why it is on the number 5 slot is because it has proven that it is a viable strategy to an extent, and also the fact that it is so incredibly cheap, probably the cheapest out of all of the decks on this list as a whole, that if you are looking to play the game competitively, whether you're a new player or you're a seasoned player, this is a very viable option if you don't have a lot of money at your disposal. So I felt that it was definitely warranted of that number 5 slot. But moving on to number 4, we have Burning Abyss. Now, Burning Abyss managed to sneak in a top 32 cut at YCS Bochum, and Burning Abyss is one of those decks that it really just doesn't die. This is probably the longest lasting meta deck we've had in this game's history. Even though it survived multiple ban lists, the deck is so flexible, something that Gem Knight FTK doesn't necessarily have. Burning Abyss is very good at adapting to the meta, and because of the core components of the deck are so good and have such high recursion, really your Burning Abyss cards are going to do what they do best. They're going to keep themselves on the board, keep adding themselves back to hand, etc., etc., and then you play your other cards that are basically going to just help enable you to further your combos or to just slow your opponent down. What's cool about Burning Abyss is if it's not the best deck, it's usually playing cards that are going to slow your opponent down enough that, you know, you can play play stuff like Anti-Spell Fragrance, you can play stuff like Mistake, you can play stuff like Unending Nightmare, and sit on a Dante or a Beatrice, and more often than not, you're gonna be fine, because depending on that particular meta, that's really all you need to establish a win. Now, the reason Burning Abyss is down here in the number 4 slot is because you're kind of relying on those particular cards to win you the game rather than the Burning Abyss cards themselves. The Burning Abyss cards are more of just the supporting engine in tandem to the floodgates that are basically going to stop your opponent from being able to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Whatsoever. However, there are still other cards that you can play and mess around with, but I think it's definitely warranted of the number 4 slot because it has shown that it is just one of the most everlasting decks that we've ever had in this game's history. Now that brings us on to number 3, which happens to be Paleozoic. Now, Paleozoic is one of those decks that, even though it's a very trap-centric deck, it's able to play very well going first or second. Now, obviously, you're going to want to play this deck going first because you are playing traps, and at the start of the game, you're going to be playing a turn behind if you happen to be going second and you're not established. However, what's very good about this deck is once it starts getting going, and once you just start activating your traps and gaining the value off of your different Paleozoic monsters and establishing Totally Awesomes, this deck snowballs to the point where it's going to be out of control and your opponent's not going to be able to catch up. And that's what I love so much about this deck. This deck's also very good because people just don't like playing against back row in general. People just have this inherent disdain for back row, and as a result of that, you can really mess with your opponent because Paleozoic is a very control style deck, and you're really just letting them play into all of your different traps and manipulating the game to how you see fit. Now, obviously, this deck has its weaknesses as well because you have to look out for all of the back row hate that people are playing in the side deck to combat your deck as a whole. Denko Sekka, Evenly Matched, these cards are what you really have to look out for, but you definitely have ways to solve those problems as well. You can play stuff like Solemn Warning, Solemn Judgment for Denko Sekka, and you can also play stuff like Mind Crush to combat Evenly Matched. And what I love about this deck compared to something like Burning Abyss is that since it's a trap-focused deck, you can play the floodgates like Anti-Spell, Unending Nightmare, things like that, but you also gain value off of those cards, which is something Burning Abyss does not. Those cards kind of conflict when it comes to Burning Abyss, but with Paleozoic, you're able to get +1s in card advantage every time you're activating one of those floodgates and really putting the pressure on your opponent, because if they're not able to come up with something to stop you from snowballing, that is how you win the game. And honestly, if you start the game off with Totally Awesome, you're going to be in a very good position. This deck is incredibly inexpensive. The only real expensive aspect of this deck is Card of Demise, and Card of Demise is getting a reprint in Legendary Collection Kaiba as well, in addition to all the hand traps. So this deck is already very budget friendly, but once Legendary Collection Kaiba is released, it's going to become even more affordable and accessible to the budget audience. Now this moves us on to number 2, and for number 2, I have ABC. Now ABC also managed to sneak in a top cut at YCS Atlanta, and ABC is kind of one of those decks that's very reminiscent and I guess symbolic of traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! Now what I mean by that is, it's kind of a all-around jack of all trades, master of none type deck. You play monsters, spells, traps, which is really good because since Masterpiece is a very viable threat in this meta, that's something that can really be difficult for decks like Paleozoic and Burning Abyss to deal with effectively. But because you're playing a deck like ABC that's very well-rounded, you're gonna have outs to be able to take care of Masterpiece no matter how it's basically tribute summoned and has the immunity to different types of card effects. You've got Dragon Buster and your whole extra deck to take care of the monster aspect. You've got spell cards that can just be very viable tools for removal. And then you've also got trap cards like Torrential Tribute, which you can play at 3 in this deck because not only is it going to help wipe out your opponent's boards, but you'll gain value off of it from your ABC pieces since they'll trigger when they hit the graveyard. So being able to play a new card like Torrential Tribute at 3, thanks to the new February Forbidden and Limited list, is very, very good and allows you to play a budget option of a board wipe since a card like Raigeki can be very expensive. And Raigeki is also going to get reprinted in Legendary Collection Kaiba as well, making it much more accessible for the budget crowd. So something else to keep in mind as well. ABC is a really good deck because it's another deck that once it gets going, it's going to be in a very good position. You've got cards like Dragon Buster, which is one of those boss monsters that if it gets established and doesn't get stopped, it's essentially going to secure you the win. It's very good removal. It allows you to access a ton of different tools in your extra deck. And one thing I really love about ABC is compared to decks like Paleozoic and Burning Abyss, it has those control elements, but also can get in for the damage when it needs to. The biggest issue with decks like Paleozoic and with Burning Abyss is that they're a little bit hindered in their ability to deal damage and seal out the game. Now, obviously, with the deck's control elements, you're basically going to control the game to the point where you win, but ABC has that X factor where it can establish and do a ton of damage when it needs to, and can seal up a game a lot quicker than some of the aforementioned decks. So that's why I give ABC a little bit more credit here, and it's a very solid deck all around, and a very simple and good deck to play nonetheless. Now this gets us to our number one budget deck of March 2018, and that deck is gonna have to be Dinosaurs. Now, Dinosaurs we've discussed a lot on this channel, basically due in part to the fact that Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is one of the craziest cards ever printed, but this is supplemented by the fact that we had Overtext Quatless printed in Extreme Force. Overtext Quatless enables us to search Double Evolution Pill, which gives us even more access to Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, being able to give us multiple threats that we can establish on the board, and makes the deck entirely more aggressive than it was pre-Extreme Force. And even though Dinosaurs didn't by themselves secure a top slot at a YCS last month, we've seen the Dinosaurs being played in several different decks, like 60 card variants, because of the fact that Overtext Quatless and Double Evolution Pill allow us to special summon Ultimate Conductor Tyranno and just get another huge monster on the board. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is also a very good way to deal with Masterpiece, not only because of the fact it has the effect that could possibly flip it face down, but also because it's 3,500 attack, meaning it can beat over the Masterpiece and make dealing with Masterpiece not as difficult as with some other decks. If you want to break the rule of this video and expand a little bit outside of the budget, you could probably build a Dinosaur Shaddoll variant of Dinosaurs for about under $200 main and extra deck. And the reason I mention this is because Dinosaur Shaddoll has been doing incredibly well on the regional level. It's been getting multiple regional tops. It's been doing well on the YCS level as well. It just hasn't secured that top 32 finish. So Dinosaur Shaddoll is definitely one of the rogue under the radar decks, but it has its presence known and is basically been tried and true at this point because it's established itself as a formidable threat in this format. Locking your opponent under a soft lock of El Shaddoll Winda and Ultimate Conductor Tyranno can just be absolutely punishing, and if your opponent doesn't have a way to out that, they might just flat out lose. Restricting you to only one special summon and having to deal with Ultimate Conductor Tyranno's effect might just be enough to win you enough games, and with the fact that this deck is relatively budget, it's a very good option. It has good aggressive tools, it's got some nice control aspect tools as well. Really solid deck, and that's why it made my number one slot. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about your top budget deck options for the March 2018 format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.